Thank you everyone for joining us for this session on collaboration through news literacy. I know it is a beautiful day outside and appreciate you making your way indoors to join us. I want to introduce first and foremost Max Wolf. You may have seen he's on the programme later for 5:45 on a session about communicating the news to young people, but he was kind enough to join us for this panel because many of us have been discussing news literacy for months now, and we find ourselves talking about this upcoming generation who isn't on the social platforms like Facebook yet, and how can we be thinking about those future generations when it comes to literacy and trust and creating informed communities. So Max is 10, and he's going to keep us honest here today and tap us on the shoulder when we say something that he disagrees with or has something to say for himself. So thank you, Max. Beside Max, we have Charlie Beckett, and Charlie is a London School Economics Media Professor and also the director of the think tank Polis. We have Dan Gilmore all the way from San Francisco, and Dan is a lecturer in media literacy with the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism in Arizona State University, so thank you to Dan. And we also have Mary Hamilton, who is executive editor of audience with The Guardian. So hopefully we've got a good representative of people who think about this a lot, the likes of Mary, who is day-to-day in the newsroom, trying to build engagement around stories, getting people to trust in the journalism of The Guardian, and then Max, who, too young yet to be on Facebook, will have a lot of thoughts for us to think about. Where I wanted to start today is that I'm conscious from talking to a lot of you, we've been talking about fake news for days, which has been wonderful in trying to kind of diagnose the problem and kind of come to some agreement. But I'm really hoping over the next 15 minutes, this is going to be a session about solutions and opportunities. Because in just a matter of weeks, Dan and I, back in December, had a conversation at Newsgeist in Phoenix, Arizona, around this whole topic of news literacy and what does it mean to create informed communities and build trust in journalism. And the point Dan made at the time was, yes, Facebook, and I put my hand up and say we have work to do and we're taking our responsibilities seriously, but there are also bigger industrial things we can do across the news industry to solve for some of the pain points that we've all experienced. And just about 6, 7, 8 weeks ago, we held this working group in Arizona State University. We brought 50 people from all over the world, from platforms, from universities, third-party organizations, academics, educators, to Arizona State University from Friday to Sunday. And we spent 3 days talking about the problems and solutions and action. And going away on the Sunday, there were 5 big themes that we all agreed on. And 2 of them, I'm really proud to say, in a matter of weeks, many of us have been able to action on. And the first ask coming away from Arizona State University that weekend was build a coalition of experts, people who think about this, who do journalism day in, day out, and get some money behind it. And hopefully most of you saw the announcement of the News Integrity Initiative this week, which is a collaboration with 25 funders and participants all over the world. But it's just the start, and I will mention the email throughout this session for those of you who hopefully are going to sit here today and go, I have an idea that, you know, Max is talking about, or Mary, or Dan, or Charlie, I have an idea that's going to help action that. And you can access, there is $14 million US in funding for research and projects to really help with news literacy and trust. And the second thing that came out of ASU, and Dan and others will speak to this, was the idea of education and tips and tricks and information on Facebook. And this week we announced public service announcements that at the top of newsfeed, when you come in there, you will see, you know, some ideas about how to go about sharing content in a responsible manner. So those are some of the things we'll touch on, but we really want this session to be one of optimism, getting to some ideas and solutions, and what action looks like coming out of here after a series of meetings in London and Berlin and Phoenix. So the first place I do want to start is just this term that we use, which is news literacy. And I'm sure for some of you sitting here today, that feels like a little bit of a foreign concept, and maybe one that doesn't resonate day to day. So maybe starting with you, Charlie, you might explain to us what news literacy means to you, and is that even the right phrase that we should be using?
Yeah, I think that it is a good phrase to start from. Obviously, I work in a university, so I think that education is a good thing. It pays for my beer. But of course, news literacy has got to be more than that. But it should start there, perhaps with people like Max. You know, in the UK, we've got a problem where the curriculum has been stuffed so full of other important things that the topic of citizenship, which used to include a kind of media news literacy learning, has dropped away. So certainly we need to see more of news education in schools, but I see it much more as a sort of lifelong thing. And it's got to be more than just talking at people in a kind of top-down way. News literacy has to be about creativity. It has to be about empowering people, not just to understand how the news works or how journalism works, but how they, especially because of social media and so on, how they not can just negotiate through the news, but can contribute to it and can be critical thinking when they are consuming it. But beyond that, I think we ought to think of news literacy as part of a kind of media citizenship. And so all the stakeholders involved in news production and dissemination need to build in the idea of literacy into what they do. And that includes, governments and corporations who produce content. They've got to make sure that it's accessible, that it's understandable, that it's accurate and reliable, and as I said, that it also empowers people, that people can share that information, they can interact with that information as well. And I think, of course, the platforms like Facebook and Google and so on also have a responsibility to build in literacy into what they do. They have to have the kind of signals to help people negotiate their way through information. That also signals to people the quality of that information, for example, and the discoverability of it. And beyond the platforms, of course, there's the journalists as well. And I think that journalists would tend to sort of say, well, that's what we do. We make information that's intelligible and accessible. And of course there's some fantastic work going on, mainly driven, of course, by the desire for survival, trying to make business, trying to connect to audiences. But I think there's a lot more that journalism can do to be more transparent, to be more interactive, to think from the user perspective, first of all, in terms of, what is relevant to people, what kind of information do they need and want, and how can they best understand it and share it. So I think it's something that can be built into, in all sorts of ways that we can talk about, into journalism itself. And in that sense, and it's a phrase we've sort of used a bit, fake or false news, I think is a wonderful opportunity for the news industry. And I think news literacy is a wonderful, I see it more as a kind of relationship or a tool that journalists can build in, and it has a kind of ethical public service value as well. And this all adds real value and real connectivity with the audience. So it's not just a classroom thing. I think it's got to be integral to whatever we do.
Right. Dan, do you want to pick that up?
Sure. Charlie's covered most of the points I would have made here. Let me make one or two further. We have a demand problem, not just a supply problem. And that's where I start when it comes to this notion of news literacy, which is a term I don't object to. I wish I had a better one, but for now it's fine. The news literacy is a subset of what people have called media literacy in the academic world for a long time. And these things basically mean knowing how to both consume and create with integrity, and at some level just know what we're talking about. We have the demand side of the equation in the sort of the fabled marketplace of ideas has been underserved by everybody. for a long time, and the three entities that I think should be the leaders in helping people be, as Charlie put it, critical thinkers, which is really what this is about. Start with educators, and actually the people who teach this would say that a good time to start in the schools is when someone is about Max's age, or perhaps earlier, but that it never stops. And a second institution that should be leading the way, if we want to make this scale beyond schools, is the news industry itself, which I should say that there are many ways that they can do it, starting with being transparent about what they do, why they do it, how they do it, in any number of ways. But there are other things, and The Guardian is exemplary compared to almost all other news organizations. And the final player in this has to be the big technology platforms, which are subsuming so much of the conversation and information, and I'm glad to see them making steps in the last couple of weeks.
Great, thank you, Dan. So, Max, Dan says there are three types of people who have to take responsibility for this. So there's people like me in Facebook, there's people like Mary in the Guardian newspaper, and then there's schools and teachers. So what do you think? Do you think this is something that would be useful to be taught in schools back in Birmingham?
I think that the kids need to understand that it's not like all shooting and fun. It's actually like really serious, and that it's quite important to know about what's going on in the world and what's happening, whereas just like praying for the people who've died in like wars and stuff.
So to be able to ask like really tough questions as well, and understand who to trust and who not to, and how to go and find somebody like Mary Hamilton when you're not so sure, is this somebody I should trust? Yeah, great. Mary, picking that up, like, you know, we start from news literacy. I think you start from a different point of view in the newsroom as somebody who thinks about elements of this day to day, but I think you would back up a little bit. So do you want to kind of give us your approach to some of the things we're talking about?
Sure. I mean, I think that making sure that our news is accessible and that we're actually kind of telling people the stories that they most need is a crucial element of what every newsroom has to be thinking about now. But I think that there's a broader issue which is around accessibility and relevance. So there was an interesting study done last year, and the study itself was around filter bubbles. The results are interesting, but what's more interesting to me was the methodology by which that study was completed. So it used Bing toolbar users, which is a bit kind of but it's, you know, at least you can tell that one toolbar user is probably one person. And they started out with a pool of 1.2 million users. And they went through the top 20 US news sites and classified sections of those sites into, I guess, what you'd call hard news versus entertainment and versus opinion. And the criteria for their study, they wanted people who'd read, I believe it was 4 hard news stories and 2 opinion pieces in the last 2 months. And that took their 1.2 million users. 4% of that group had actually read that many news stories and opinion stories. Now, to me, that's actually a much larger issue than the issue of the people who are already engaged but perhaps don't know who to trust. The broader issue is the people who are not engaged, who maybe don't want to be engaged, who don't see why news is relevant to them, or who are having trouble accessing news that is relevant to them. And I think that especially in the US, this is kind of concordant with some of the deterioration in local news, which we're starting to see signs of in the UK as well, though with the BBC present, that does to some extent serve to shore that up. So we kind of have multiple sort of, we have a sort of nested doll of problems here. Firstly, there's the issue of how do you get people who just don't care to start to care about news sort of as more broadly. Secondly, how do we as newsrooms create news that actually engages those people, helps them understand why news is relevant to them. then you get into questions of people starting to understand what sorts of news they're reading, whether or not they can trust the sources that they're reading. And you even start getting into questions like, well, if I know I can trust The Guardian, do I as a reader understand whether or not I'm reading an opinion piece or a leader, which is The Guardian's sort of branded opinion, versus a reported news story? And do most readers not necessarily understand the difference between them? So there's kind of a sort of a broader set of issues here than just things that are accessible and deliverable through a newsroom sort of tweaking what we do. I think the other thing I'd say is that schools is a kind of crucial element of engaging with news literacy, but my sense is that by the time you're old enough to vote, we might be delivering the news on voice interfaces through distributed sort of technology platforms that aren't accessible today. And I'm not sure what skills we can teach you now that you're going to be able to use in 10 years' time to accurately assess those new forms of delivery. I'm wondering if you guys have thoughts on that.
It's not about teaching Max how to use any technology. It's about making sure Max is skeptical of everything he sees. Which I think a lot of younger people are, which is a good thing. They're not skeptical enough of their friends. That's a problem, but it's good that they're getting skeptical. That's very helpful.
Okay. So, giving people access to content, one problem. We've used the word trust a lot in the last few days. Like, are large pieces of literacy really, in fact, just about trust? Before we get to kind of solutions and action, is that, Charlie or Dan, is that one of the biggest problems here that we have to tackle first, and only by solving for trust can we get to solutions then around literacy and access? And Mary talks about labelling and branding.
Yeah, and I think trust is another one of those words which we use, and we should always use it in a sort of qualified way, that trust is never absolute. It's not that one particular source or one particular news brand is entirely trustworthy and others are not. And any given bit of content, it's always arguable. And that's, again, what we mean about this idea of critical thinking. But again, it seems to me blatantly obvious that for people to understand how they might trust a piece of content or a source, then they should have tools in the same way that we do when we drive a car. We expect to have a map, we expect the engine to work in certain ways and the buttons to have certain effects, and we learn how to drive. Where you take that car still depends upon you, and I think literacy is a bit like that. And the trust is, if you like, to pursue this metaphor to death, the trust is a bit like the fuel in the car. It's a means to understand and evaluate content. It's not a given. There's not going to be a trust button, I hope anyway, on Facebook that tells you that this is good and this other stuff is not trustworthy. It's much more about a relationship. And of course, what Mary's been talking about, this is already happening to a degree, but I think we can tell, the fake news, so-called, is a bit of a kind of wake-up call. It's more of a symptom of a wider sense that people feel this overwhelming. It's partly about scale of information. There's so much information. And somebody like Max, quite different to the dark ages when I was your age, where there was a scarcity of information. But Max, if he's anywhere near the internet, there's going to be news somewhere, whether he chooses to have it or not. And I bet your generation is much more exposed to news, even if you don't go looking for it, than anyone else. So this isn't some sort of option, it's a tool for living.
Right, okay. So Max, you were telling us earlier that you like The Guardian. I'm not sure that was just because Mary happened to be standing beside you. But why is it that you like looking at The Guardian? And so tell me the answer to that. But if you were to bring The Guardian newspaper into your classroom and your teacher was to start teaching your classroom about The Guardian, what are some of the things you would like, if this was a special class about what sources, what news to trust, what do you think would your friends be interested in learning? How would your teacher need to go about ensuring that by the end of the class they know some questions to ask. So what do you think would be useful to people your age in a classroom?
I think more on some of the elections that are going around in the world, and a bit more on this country than other countries around the world.
So understanding how politics and elections work. Okay,
Yeah.
so getting to the who and the what and the where and the how and the why, which are all the things that journalists think about every day. So
Yeah.
having kids kind of think about those questions.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Dan, this is something you've given a lot of thought to, is the classroom situation. So going back to big moonshot ideas, and we all know from coming to conferences like this, there is funding, there are big ideas. What are some of the things that you feel really passionate about and that the time is finally here to come and execute on, to action?
Wouldn't know where to start. I did want to quickly say something about what Charlie had said about trust. There are tens of millions of people in the United States who trust everything Donald Trump says, and that Breitbart puts on its website, and that Fox News plays every evening on its commentary shows. So I'm, like Charlie, wary of the word trust. I'm not sure what it means. If it's, I think we want to trust things that are true. That would be a good start. But some of the things that came out of that meeting we had that I thought were pretty interesting ideas. Some years ago in the United States, there was a campaign against tobacco, basically, against smoking cigarettes. And through lots of public information and advertising and other campaigning and propaganda, outright propaganda in search of truth in this case, people were persuaded, younger people in particular, were largely persuaded that smoking was kind of disgusting and a bad thing. Maybe we could persuade the world in an analogous way that spreading lies is a bad thing. I don't know if that's possible, but it's a big idea that a couple of people had. Things vary by country. I don't know exactly what happens in UK schools, so I wouldn't extrapolate ideas from the US system, which is very haphazard in educating people on any of this stuff. But there were people saying let's make sure we get every single 12-year-old in America to understand how to be a critical thinker and to understand the difference between what's true and what's not. I would probably add to that, based on what Mary is saying, how do we get them to care about what citizenship is all about, which is not just voting, but participation, and many other things. So we have a list.
Mary?
So I think on that trust point, trust is at its heart is about trusting the motives of other people, and this is something that keeps sort of coming up in discussions that we're having here and elsewhere. Fundamentally, if you are able to believe that the motives of the people that you're arguing with, or of the organisation's work that you're reading, if you trust that their motives are good or aligned with yours, then you can get somewhere. And if you believe that their motives are not aligned with yours, or they are somehow underhand, then you're never going to trust what they say, even if what they say accords beautifully with what you personally believe. And we're in a universe now where the mainstream media, or the MSM, which is the acronym that gets used certainly in UK circles, is actively distrusted by a lot of people. And it's gotten to the point now where that belief that the mainstream media is not trustworthy is self-reinforcing, to the point where you can see people tweeting things like, the MSM won't tell you about this story, and the link will be to like the Telegraph or the Guardian or the BBC, which is probably as close to being mainstream media as you can realistically get. But people are just that there is a disconnect in a lot of public discourse between this idea of media I can trust, i.e. media where I believe and I am in accordance with the motives of, and the mainstream media. So there's a real task and a real challenge for us there about how we become more transparent about who owns us, why we act the way we do, what decisions we make, and why we make those decisions. So at The Guardian, we're doing several things around that. We're looking at how we better signpost our ownership structure. So for those who don't know, The Guardian is owned by a trust. We are not owned by sort of single kind of proprietors. How we are transparent about our ownership structure, how we say that actually we're owned by a group of people whose job is to promote and sustain our journalism, and that's their only job. There is no sort of grand profit-making enterprise. There are no shareholders that are making bank. We're not owned by individuals who are trying to use the organisation to gain political power. And when people find that out, we discover that they tend to trust us much more. The problem is how we tell them that in a way that doesn't just sound like kind of grabbing them by the throat and saying, hey, you should trust us. Because the minute you sort of aggressively try to push that, that puts people off. So there's a kind of very sort of complicated and dance that you have to do around explaining to people some of the motive forces behind what they're seeing without making them feel like you're aggressively trying to persuade them to trust you, because one of the worst things you can do, and if you want to be trusted, is demand that somebody trusts you, because immediately people get suspicious. It's a really kind of messy, complicated space.
What does transparency look like on a practical level? Like, is it showing people like Max and everyone here how the sausage is made? What did the journalist do to verify their sources and the location and the date? So giving more of kind of almost the metadata behind the story. Like, do you think that would be helpful signposting as well? And is that something across platforms and publishers that we need to be thinking about, is some kind of universal context that we give the audience that will, one, help with trust, and two, help them make a decision about, is this informing me? Is this something I've now reached my own decision on that I feel comfortable sharing with my friends and family?
Honestly, I think that's part of it. I think there's a great deal that we already signal a lot of this stuff in news stories. We already sort of, when we use quotes, there's specific kinds of language that we'll use around those quotes, or around bylines. For example, we might include date lines to indicate that there is actually a reporter on the ground doing reporting physically present. On opinion pieces, we might include in the byline two sentences that explain why somebody was asked to write about this particular topic. Are they an expert? Are they someone who has an opinion that we believe needs to be taken more seriously? And I think the Trust Project has looked at a whole sort of range of different elements that go into making a news story that is as truth is complicated, right? But a verified news story where a journalist has been involved, has gone out and gotten quotes. It's not a rewrite of somebody else's story. It contains original reporting. I think there's elements around that we could start to surface across platform in a way that would be helpful algorithmically to platforms as well when it comes to deciding sort of what signals to look for in the content that gets promoted.
Great. Are there, and throw this open, Charlie or Dan or Max, but are there innovative things that we should be thinking about that redefine journalism and make it more relevant to people now, that we almost need to go back and think about how to make information and news cool? There's almost, there's going to be no one solution here, but it's thinking about how people relate to news and to stories. And what does that look like?
Well, I don't know about making it cool, but in a funny kind of way, news is already highly in demand. People consume more news than ever before, especially when you do a broader definition, and they may not call it news. One of the things we've discovered is that people consume a lot of news without thinking of it as news, and that's partly because, of course, it pops up in your so-called news feed on Facebook or whatever, alongside a whole bunch of other stuff that may be personal, entertainment, whatever, and so it kind of gets mixed up. And then if you turn that one around, I think Mary said it's interesting about sort of algorithms. I'm interested partly in, if you like, the news literacy of the journalists, in the sense of trying to understand what is it that people are interested in. I don't just mean that you're going to do whatever they want just to get clickbait, but that we actually don't understand much about the conversations that people are having out there. And one of the things that I hope will emerge over the next year or two is better understanding of and usage of things, artificial intelligence, of data analysis that will tell us more about what is already happening in the sort of information ecosystem out there. What are people talking about? What interests them? And where the gaps are as well, as Mary said, where are the gaps where people aren't getting information or good information? So I think there's a lot that we can find out more. So not just data analytics about, you know, how many people click on your website or how many people read the story, but actually trying to discover more. And I think that is a kind of literacy about news or about the public for news people.
And something that we've been working on or started to work on fairly recently is explicitly asking readers on some stories around some topics, what would you like to know more about? What don't you understand? We tried this with the conflict in Yemen. And discovered quite quickly that there were sort of that there's an enormous appetite from readers to have some basic questions answered, and B, that those questions are not always questions that we are expecting readers to have. So that's kind of, I think we're still kind of at the beginning of a process of understanding what we do with that knowledge and how we disseminate it. But of course, that's only something that we can really achieve on our own platform. And you know, I know various people in other panels have sort of discussed the data issue. But there's a real question mark for us. If we see as part of our public mission is getting news out to communities where historically or sort of demographically we don't think news is being read or being understood, we have very few methods digitally of understanding whether or not we're being effective at that. And that's something that, you know, platforms like Facebook absolutely have the data stored to be able to help us to understand and to see that. And I think that'd be a very interesting place for collaboration.
Yeah, like that question of data is one that has come up in all of our travels in recent weeks at workshops and roundtables. And for those of you who saw Adam Mosseri's keynote yesterday, this was something that Jeff Jarvis asked about. And I think Adam gave a commitment there that this is something we're hearing, and we'll go back inside and look at seeing what are the opportunities around that, because it's definitely something that's being represented by journalists world over at the moment. Max, I want to ask you about the example that Mary gave there, that, you know, journalists publish a story and at the bottom there is, what more would you like to know? Have we done a good job at explaining this story to you? Do you think that journalists and editors do a good job of asking readers and the public, have we told you everything you need to know? Do you think they do a good job of communicating complex issues to children?
I think that for kids' news programs, they kind of look down on us and think we need really easy stuff to get our hands on. But I think they look down on us too much, and then it gets confusing for the kids, and they put in less detail than we want them to. So I think adult news programs like CNN and BBC are more appropriate than the actual ones that are made for kids.
Okay, that's interesting. Hopefully everybody will take that point on board going back to your newsrooms next week. I throw this question out to each of you, which is that, you know, Aaron Pilhofer has often asked this question of what would news organisations look like if they optimise for trust. So we're coming back to this again. This has been a question that has come up at a lot of conferences in recent years and in discussions with journalists. We now have the ability, if we need to go and do research. We have the ability to tap into funding, probably like never before. It's pretty unprecedented. So now that there is this opportunity, Charlie, Mary, Dan, to build newsrooms, optimise for trust, for creating informed communities, for improving literacy, what is that going to look like in 2017? That's my final question before we throw it out to the audience to see are there some tangible ideas that the News Integrity Initiative should be thinking about.
God. Very quickly, I think it's going to be about continued experimentation. I always think, for example, about, you know, The Guardian a few years ago as a pioneer of transparency, you did that thing where they published their news list every day, so the public could see what the journalists were thinking about. And I think it died a death, didn't it? Because nobody bothered looking at it after a while, because it was a bit dull. And of course, the exciting thing is to be in the newsroom talking about it. And I know you sort of wanted people to do that. And I think the lesson of that is very much that these initiatives should start from the user point of view. And as Mary said, news organisations know quite a bit about the people who already use their news, although, as you said with that last great example, you can still find out much more about how you can add value to that relationship. So I think that it's not just about this business of having widgets or badges on the content. It really is about trying to discover more, and we do now have the technology increasingly. Jonathan Albright's fantastic presentation about fake news was hugely alarming and disturbing, but that same kind of analysis might be able to tell us other things about what people are talking about, what they're interested in, and so we might be able to use that kind of information to inform the way we make our journalism.
When you, Charlie, think to research, though, where do you feel, before we go spending money on it, coming in and commissioning projects and ideas, stepping back for a moment, though, where for you, who's somebody who's passionate about research and applied research, where do we need to start? Like, where are some of the gaps right now in our understanding that we quickly have to get to grips with if collectively platforms, publishers, educators, schools are going to actually spend money in meaningful ways?
I could list you 10 very fundable research projects that we could do tomorrow, but I think one of them, for example, it would be partly to road test some of the assumptions we now make. So, for example, when we have that conversation about false news and filter bubbles, we often start citing behavioural science. And most of us know nothing about behavioural science, but we start citing it in quite a sort of deterministic way. We say human beings are hardwired to only believe stuff that they agree with. I'm not so sure that very simple statement is an adequate way to think about people's relationship to truth and information. So I would, for example, like to do much more work on, how news is situated in people's lives. It's almost like an anthropology thing, so it's not really my department. But that idea of really going to how the relevance of news literally in people's lives, and often the paradoxical and contradictory relationships that they have news. We tend to make kind of rational assumptions. I don't know why. People aren't, they're human, they're not rational. So there's lots of research that isn't just about the algorithms and the numbers. It is a kind of behavioural question, I think, as well.
Dan or Mary, anything you want to pick up there?
Well, I think there's something interesting about this idea of sort of news organisations optimising for trust, because an individual organisation optimising for trust is sort of all well and good, but the entire industry is never going to do that. There are organisations that are not interested in optimising for being trusted or in optimising for truth. And I think we have to, actually accept as an industry that is the case. And that functionally, a Guardian article and a Breitbart article may be indistinguishable to the average reader, in part by design and in part through, if we're all on instant articles, it all looks the same anyway, and it's actually very difficult to tell where the source is coming from. Secondly, certainly within Facebook's ecosystem, and I think in other ecosystems as well, we know that users trust the person who shares, not necessarily the source. The vast majority of sort of trust in that network is owned by the individuals, not by brands. And Facebook's algorithm prioritizes, information that your friends and family have shared over and above the trustworthiness or truthfulness of any given source. So actually, The Guardian could optimise every single element of its processes for truth tomorrow and probably be sitting exactly where we are now, having had no meaningful impact on the broader media ecosystem. So I'd like to kind of throw that question back and say, what would Facebook look like? What would platforms look like if they were optimised for trust?
Yeah, great question. So the question of not knowing who your source is sometimes when something is pushed out from friends and family. This again is something that's been coming up particularly the last few weeks, that idea of can Facebook help to amplify the Guardian brand more so that somebody doesn't just turn around and say, I saw it on Facebook, and instead they say, I saw it from The Guardian on Facebook. And that's definitely something we're giving thought to. How can we better amplify The Guardian, for example, as a brand? One of the other things we're giving a lot of thought to, there's been this huge debate about polarisation. And so one of the things that we're giving a lot of thought to is how can we serve up more content? And rather than, let's say you read a right-wing point of view or a left-wing point of view, rather than just serve you up an alternative one point of view, we have found through our research that actually tends to make people more entrenched in their original point of view. So one of the things that we're looking at is, can we serve up instead a suite of different perspectives? So maybe you see 4 or 5 different content pieces, so you can see where exactly your opinion currently falls, and that maybe by seeing a selection of 4 or 5 articles, that's going to help you build a more complete picture. And that's something we really do want to get to. For those of you who saw Mark Zuckerberg's 6,000 word letter some weeks back, that was one of the core goals in there, is that polarization, the idea of unconscious biases, that has existed for a long time. How, through a platform like Facebook, which is unprecedented in its 1.8 billion community, how can it be a place where you come to find the complete picture? And it's something we're giving a lot of thought to, Mary, and I really hope we'll be able to come back here this time next year and really demonstrate that we've taken feedback like that on board. So,
can I just say, I agree with Mary's call for you to think a lot. Well, sorry, not you personally, Anya, but Facebook and the others, everyone else. Facebook is still not the whole world. We should remind ourselves. But I think it's important that we don't think of especially with news literacy, that we don't think of this as a solution or the solution. Yeah. This is a process, and we don't actually want to have a one standard. I think we want a kind of diversity in news literacy, a diversity in trust, if you like, a kind of competition of trust. The useful thing is for people to have the literacy to make the choices, but I don't want to I certainly don't want Facebook to decide, yep, the Guardian is approved, stamp, because you can't. Some of the Guardian stuff is dreadful, and should not be trusted. Very little, of course, but most of it's magnificent. But, so I'm very loath to start having, rigid codes, and I'm loath to have, especially dominant platforms making absolute decisions, which I know you weren't talking about. You were talking about a range, and I think it's the best. Yeah,
and I think on that, Facebook does not want to be the arbiters of truth, and I'm sure many of you would agree to that, but we do have a responsibility for how people use our platform and the conversations that they have there. And hopefully a lot of you have learned in the last few days about how we are taking those responsibilities seriously, particularly when it comes to false news and attaching trusted sources. So, very quickly, for those of you who haven't seen it, we do have this program around false news and misinformation, where our community are flagging what they believe to be suspicious content. Third-party fact-checking organisations are working on that content. When more than one of them agrees that this is hoax, this is not something to be trusted, they can put a flag on it for the Facebook community that says, this has been disputed by third-party fact-checking organisations. You should consider whether you really want to share this. And that can potentially be downranked in Facebook. You can't put ads to it. So there's a lot of work like that happening on Facebook as part of just wider solutions. And I think that's an important point. I, for one, would not sit here today and say news literacy is the only solution. It's one of a myriad of things that we have to do as a platform, but also in collaboration with the industry. This is a problem that is ultimately bigger than Facebook, and we have to work with the industry to address it. Okay, throwing it out to the floor with the few minutes that we have left. Who would like to go first with a question? Okay, we're here at the front. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to share a thought with the panel. In the old day, people used to say, oh, I've seen that news on TV, therefore it's true. Now it's, I've seen that news online, therefore it's true. And I agree, it's our role at the school, at the community level, to build people critical thinking so that they are skeptical of what they are presented. My concern is how to find the right balance, to find the middle way between being skeptical with what we are presented, especially when it comes from our government and authorities, and to not fall into not believing what we are presented, or into all the conspiracy theory that are polluting the internet. Just to give an example, like a few years ago in the US with the Obama birth certificate story, that Trump kept hanging that, oh, it's a fake, and even all the hard facts, he kept saying that it's the birth certificate presented by Obama, it's a fake, and we should not believe in it. And so my question is like, as much hard fact and well-checked information you can present it, you will always find someone who will say the opposite. And with now the open source on the internet, it takes you a few seconds to find the opposite. So I agree that news literacy is important, but maybe we should bring into the conversation also accountability, to hold accountable people who are spreading fake news and who are damaging our democracy. And maybe sometimes we focus too much on tools. We want tools, we want a technique, but maybe it's much more complex than that, and how to hold accountable people who are spread fake news. I don't know if we should like shut Trump Twitter account. Just like holding accountable people who spread fake news.
Right. Who would like to take that first? So I think I'm going to try and summarize your question, but it's trying to kind of get that balance between being skeptical but not buying into every conspiracy theory. So that's one part of your question. And the second part of your question, I think, is how do you maybe reward people who share accurate, trustworthy information, and how do you maybe hold people accountable who share false and misinformation? Anyone want to pick up those kind of two strands of the question?
I mean, all I was... Do you want to?
No,
Thank you. I was going to say that, yes, but I sort of believe in a kind of marketplace of ideas, and I'm a bit uncomfortable if you're going to turn accountability into prescription or even regulation. You know, I think that the idea of news literacy is you encourage people to be critical, not cynical, but I don't think you should sort of punish people for being stupid or evil in that sense. I think it is much more that you are, the reward can often be that, you know, do you really want to, do you want to be seen as untrustworthy yourself? You know, and I think news literacy kind of nudge people into understanding better that if they are sharing stuff that's nonsense, then if they do share it, then the other person might know it's nonsense as well, so you don't look so clever. I prefer that kind of behavioural, whatever the word is, sanctions, rather than, you know, banning people from Facebook for a week if they've shared something from Breitbart, you know.
Anyone else want to add to that?
I think there's a key element to addressing both things, which is asking the question why. So with your second sort of question about how we can hold people accountable, I think that's about community standards as much as anything else. And I think if you're in an environment where you're seeing somebody sharing something and you're not sure why they're sharing it or whether they actually believe it's true, then asking that question, why do you think that's true? What is it about that you feel is relevant or appropriate? Asking that why question can be a kind of crucial way to not call people out in a way that forces them to sort of get entrenched in their views and back themselves up for fear of looking stupid. But that curiosity can be a way to help people open up a little bit to the idea that what they've shared might not be right, but there might be something else out there that they can stand by, and they can pull out the nugget that they actually want to talk about and talk about that instead.
Do you want Okay.
On this subject. Don't you think that it's important to involve people in the process more than every other thing? It's because I think that the answer is bad. I think that the most important people that the most important thing is that people is the people are how to say I'm searching the word that people is are concentrate about the questions, not the answers. It's because probably we are too but that's it.
Anyone on that? Involving people in the process?
I think what you're getting at is that this should all be conversation and not lecturing, and that journalists don't do that very well, and there's all kinds of things related to that, but the first rule of a conversation is to listen.
I think so. One of the most interesting pieces of work that we've done recently, a journalist called Gary Young, who works at The Guardian, went out to Muncie in the US to cover the election there. And he went out and explicitly said, I don't know what it is that I need to be writing about. Please tell me. Talk to me. And we ran that project for several weeks, with Gary being very active in the comment threads under his articles, also sort of explicitly asking for tips, for knowledge, for information, for those who were reading that series to say where they thought the stories were, what they felt about various different issues, and to help to sort of bring to life the political reality of what was going on in that town. And those were some incredibly well-trusted pieces of journalism, in part because they didn't start from a position of the journalist as the expert parachuting in to explain to Muncie what Muncie was about. It started from the journalist in a position of ignorance, saying, I don't know what I'm going to find here. I don't know what the story is. Please tell me. And that's a very old journalistic tactic. That's old school journalism using new school tools. And I think we absolutely have to run projects like that in that way consistently. Otherwise, we lose any capacity to claim that we are effectively reporting on the communities that we claim to serve.
Okay, great, thank you. We are out of time. I want to give a huge thank you to Miri, Dan, Charlie, and of course Max, who brought an invaluable perspective. Thank you, Max. You can hear more from Max at 5:45. He's going to be on a panel with Matthew Ingram, Jeff Jarvis, Lucy Marcus. So thank you everyone for your attention, and we'll talk to you shortly. Thank you. Well done.
Well done, mate.
Do you have a phone now?
Yeah.
There's a very small little thank you. It's a Mophie. Have you got one of those for charging your phone when it runs out of power?
Preghiamo tutte le persone di lasciare la sala per poter dare spazio al nuovo panel. Grazie.